Hi, welcome to Al-Muqaddimah. My name is Syawish. Slavery is one of the darkest chapters in not only Islamic history but also world history. Slavery has existed within Islam since the very beginning. At the time of the Prophet, slavery was quite common in Arabia, and as Islam expanded outside of Arabia in the 7th and 8th centuries CE, slavery expanded as well. However, slavery under Islamic rule was quite a bit different than it was under previous empires. Islam allowed slavery, but also put some restrictions on the treatment of slaves and gave them legal protections. As a result, in the Islamic world, the word slave could come to mean a number of things, and in fact, it represented a spectrum of unfreedom rather than a binary. Rather than being either a free person or a slave, there were categories in between those two as well. Hence, slaves in the Islamic society were at different positions in the social hierarchy. You could be a slave and yet be leading an army or running the government behind only the caliph. This led to more friction and hence quite a bit of slave rebellions, given that slaves were holders of some political power and could muster up enough men to seriously challenge the government. Today, we'll discuss the greatest slave rebellion in the history of Islam, the Zanj rebellion, which challenged the great Abbasid Caliphate from 869 to 883 CE. Before we begin, I'd like to tell everyone that my merchandise store is now up on almuqaddimah.com, where you can find really cool wall posters like the Timeline of Islamic History, which condenses 1400 plus years of Islamic history into a beautiful timeline. There are two versions of that chart, one with portraits of important figures and one without, so you can pick whichever one you prefer. We also have a map of the fall of Al-Andalus, which shows, century by century, how Muslim empires lost ground in Spain and Portugal until their eventual collapse on the Iberian Peninsula. So be sure to check it out. That's the best way to support Al-Muqaddimah and show off some love for Islamic history. Alternatively, if you want to support Al-Muqaddimah financially, you can join these awesome patrons over on patreon.com. The links to everything are in the description. Back to the video. Before we talk about the Zanj revolt, let me give you a bit of background of the political history of the Islamic world before the revolt. So as you probably know, Islam began with Prophet Muhammad, who passed away in 632 CE, and his successors, known as the Rashidun caliphs, invaded the Roman Byzantine and the Persian Sassanid empires to the north and took over major portions of their former territories. The Rashidun Caliphate was replaced by the Umayyad Caliphate following a civil war in 661 CE. The Umayyads ruled for about 9 decades before they succumbed to one of the many non-Arab rebellions and fell to the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasid Caliphate changed the capital of the Islamic Empire from the ancient city of Damascus to the city of Baghdad, which they had newly founded in Iraq between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They then experienced a golden age under caliphs like Al-Mansur, Harun al-Rashid, and Al-Ma'mun. However, upon Al-Ma'mun's death, power was seized by his brother Al-Mu'tasim, who had a huge edge over everyone else. You see, he had something of a private army made up of Turkic slave soldiers. Turkic boys and men were captured in border raids along the Caliphate's northern border in Central Asia, and they were then brought to Baghdad, where they were sold. Al-Mu'tasim had used his considerable wealth to build up a small army of loyal slaves who, under his reign, were put in power throughout the Abbasid administration. However, they rubbed the older elites of the Caliphate the wrong way. The older elites were made up of Arab and Persian Muslims who saw the Turks as lowly slaves who had no business being in government. Al-Mu'tasim built a separate city, some 160 kilometers to the north of Baghdad, called Samarra, where he moved his government, which was now firmly in the hands of the Turks. Upon Al-Mu'tasim's death, it was the Turks who held all the cards, and they did not play nice. They picked the candidates they thought would be easy to control. However, one of those candidates, Caliph al-Mutawakkil, was not so easy to control, and he sought to overthrow the control of the Turks. He even deposed and killed some of them, but the Turks managed to get the upper hand when they assassinated al-Mutawakkil himself at a party at his palace in 861, throwing the Caliphate into a tailspin. This started the period known as the Anarchy at Samarra. During this period, the Abbasid Caliphate faced one crisis after another, with caliphs coming and going at the drop of a hat. A civil war ensued as well, and the Turks themselves couldn't agree with each other, which led to factions appearing throughout the capital. Rampant corruption meant that the caliph couldn't pay his army. The caliphate's grip over its territory became weak as rebellions rose up throughout the empire and allies walked away. The Zanj rebellion was just one of these crises. The Zanj rebellion is called as such because many of the participants were or had been Zanj slaves. Zanj was a term used in Arabic to refer to black slaves from the Swahili coast, which comprises modern-day coastal Tanzania, Kenya, and northern Mozambique. To make sense of this rebellion and understand what drove its participants as well as what it wanted to do, a knowledge of Islamic slavery in general and the Abbasid regime in particular is important. Slaves had been a significant element in the society of the Near East, including Arabia and Persia, before the arrival of Islam. Slaves were also present in the cities of Mecca and Medina at the time of the Prophet. However, it's important to realize that these slaves were not just black. The modern scholar Hend Gilli-Elewy, through her analysis of the slaves in early Islamic society, says that aside from the black slaves like Abyssinians and Nubians, there were Arab, Persian, Copt, as well as Byzantine slaves. Even in Islamic tradition, we know of a companion of the Prophet called Salman the Persian, who was originally a slave. We also know of Maria the Copt, who was a concubine of the Prophet and mother to his son Ibrahim. However, it appears that Arab slaves were in majority. One Arab slave mentioned in Islamic tradition of note is Zayd ibn al-Haritha, who originally came from the Kalb tribe of the Arabs and was a personal slave to the Prophet. However, the Prophet later adopted him as his son, and he came to be known as Zayd ibn Muhammad. Before the rise of Islam, of course, the region was dominated by the Byzantine and Sassanid empires, and it would be a massive understatement to say that they were rivals. They fought each other for some 30 mostly continuous years before the rise of Islam. In the larger rivalry of the Sassanid and Byzantine empires, the Christian kingdom of Aksum in modern-day Ethiopia sided with the Byzantines, being their fellow Christians. Eventually, a Christian kingdom in southern Arabia, in the region of modern-day Yemen, was established as well. One of its leaders, Abraha, led the well-known expedition against Mecca in the year of the elephant, which is known as Am al-Fil in Islamic tradition. According to Islamic tradition, he wanted to destroy the sacred shrine at Mecca to dissuade pilgrims from going there. The army was destroyed through God's intervention, who sent birds to drop pebbles on them. However, historians believe that it was likely smallpox or some similar epidemic that stopped the army from reaching Mecca. As a result of this Christian kingdom, a large number of Ethiopians had arrived in southern Arabia. However, in 575 CE, the Persians defeated the Ethiopians. After this setback, Abyssinians in Arabia became vulnerable, and many were captured and enslaved. So, as Hend Gilli-Elewy points out, warfare, rather than international slave trade, was the primary cause behind the presence of black slaves in the Hijaz region, which are mentioned time and again in various episodes from the Prophet's life. However, in understanding Abbasid slavery, What happened after that initial period is important. The Muslim Arab conquerors settled in garrison cities, away but not far from established centers of power. There, they certainly had slaves who were non-Muslim, as it wasn't allowed to enslave fellow Muslims. The previous empires in the region, namely the Byzantines and the Sassanids, also had considerable slave populations themselves. So, with the establishment of Muslim rule, there was continuity as well as some change. Besides what can be called Islamic religious sources, material for the study of slavery in the 1st century of Islam is relatively scarce. Many non-Muslims worked as scribes, officials, masons, and architects in the Umayyad Caliphate. Some of them were probably slaves. Eunuchs were also kept as slaves in the period, performing the key function of supervising the women's quarters in the royal households. Muslims also held slave concubines, a practice which had been prevalent since the Prophet's time and continued throughout the Umayyad and Abbasid periods. Both the Quran and the Prophet's traditions allowed Muslims to have slaves, but slowly a set of legal limitations started to appear around them. Slaves were regarded as chattel and could be bought, sold, rented, or inherited. With some exceptions, Muslim scholars agreed that slaves could not own property. They also couldn't testify in court. However, they could actually take their owner to court in the case of a breach of contract or exceptionally poor treatment. This wasn't a universal ability though. Beginning from the start, the Quran and the Hadith, i.e. the sayings of the Prophet, exhorted Muslims to compassionately care for the enslaved. Manumission or freeing slaves was a highly encouraged and rewarded deed in the Quran. Verses from the Quran urge Muslims to free slaves as an act of piety. The Quran also encourages owners to accept manumission agreements if the slave proposes them. In a hadith, owners were taught to give slaves the same food and clothing that they themselves have. However, Muslim scholars and laymen saw this as an ideal rather than an obligation. Additionally, there were lesser punishments for most crimes for slaves. The scholar Jonathan Brown says that many Muslim customs of slavery continued with earlier traditions in the Near East, especially Roman law. For example, a person's free or slave status was traced from their mother without any such ruling in the Shariah. But there were also many differences, such as treating the child from the master and his concubine as legitimate, whereas in the Roman law, the child would have been illegitimate. As many scholars have discussed, the conditions of different slaves under so-called Islamic slavery were often very dissimilar. A fortunate slave may go on to become an elite, influential member of the military. But that, of course, doesn't mean that this was the lot of the average slave. Some women did rise to become important players in court politics, but that cannot be read to mean that the average concubine had any authority or agency. Also, many types of slavery, like rural agricultural slavery, have not been documented well enough, with sources focusing heavily on urban slavery. Thus, there is a paucity of information there as well. No doubt there were excesses on slaves, and slavery in general is an awful institution. However, the option of complaining to authority existed as mentioned before. Slaves also complained in the Sharia courts regarding their treatment. When the offense was proven, slaves were often let go. Interestingly, we have many actual cases from the later Ottoman Empire in the 16 and 1700s when slaves took their masters to court, but that's not quite relevant to the Abbasid Caliphate. It must be noted though that the Sharia wasn't the only factor shaping slaves' lives. For example, Islamic law laid down that Muslims couldn't be enslaved. In reality, many Muslims were taken as slaves. Eventually, in fact, slave raids in Africa became more about the color of a person's skin rather than their faith. A black Muslim could be captured and sold as slave. Freed non-Arab slaves often became important figures. Famous early Muslim scholars like Nafi, Ibn Sirin, and Hassan al-Basri were mawali, meaning freed slaves. In the Abbasid era, Ibn al-Mubarak, a prominent scholar, was the son of a Turkic slave. From these examples, it becomes clear that the descendants of slaves did not form a separate group in Muslim society. They were absorbed into society as fellow Muslims. This is a marked difference from, for example, American slavery, where blacks were seen as different even post-emancipation. Besides, some slaves could become really close to their masters, especially when they were raised in the latter's houses from a young age. As such, they were sort of in the family in these contexts. In fact, the later Seljuk vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, is recorded as having said that a single obedient slave is better than 300 sons, because the sons want the father's death, while the slaves want his master's glory. The historian Matthew Gordon points out that with the Abbasid era, there was a surge in the demand of slaves of a variety of types. Slave markets existed in cities like Fustat, Baghdad, and Samarra. By the 800s, many slave trading networks were in place. Slaves were brought in from Western and Eastern Africa, India, Central Asia, as well as the Slav regions of Northeastern Europe. Currency hoards show that during the 9th century, slaves and money circulated between Baghdad and the southern Volga region. Michael McCormick remarks that the cities of the Islamic world had a, quote, voracious appetite for enslaved labor, especially after the bubonic plague in 750 cut down indigenous labor supply. Thus, it was a huge part of the Abbasid economy. A ton of ink has been spilled describing the use cases of various types of slaves. In the 11th century, Ibn Batlan, for example, wrote about how Indians and Nubians make the best guards, while the Zanj and Armenians make the best domestic slaves. The presence of slaves in any urban landscape would have been impossible to miss for any traveler. Abbasid slave owners looked for slaves with specific skills. Formal training was often given for these skills, including to courtesans and slave soldiers. Eunuchs, like in the Umayyad era and pretty much all later Muslim empires, were employed in the management and defense of the women's area in royal and elite households. The Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir is said to have employed more than 10,000 eunuchs, including Africans and Europeans. In addition to that, many women slaves were used for domestic work. Slaves owned by merchants were employed to assist in business. Though not as well documented, slaves seem to be employed in skilled urban crafts such as guards or chefs or, like I mentioned before, even as military. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mu'tasim was the first to give a major place in the army to Turkic soldiers. He had close relations with Turkic commanders, several of whom became imperial power brokers. The military slaves held estates, high-level positions, and high salaries. Their importance in the Abbasid politics becomes clear while looking at the period known as the Anarchy at Samarra. Another very important group of slaves was that of the concubines. Before Islam, concubines existed in the Sassanid and Byzantine empires. However, as the historian Gordon remarks, there was some degree of disapproval regarding concubines in these empires. In the Islamic world, concubines were normal. The Quran itself considers slave concubines to be, quote, possessions of the right hand and sees sexual intercourse with them as legitimate. In the Islamic era, concubinage was a widespread practice. Unlike wives, of which a man can only take 4, there was no limit on the number of concubines, and their children, born of slave concubines and their masters, were regarded as free and legitimate. However, the slave women's children with anyone else were slaves. Important in this regard is that slave concubines who gave birth to their master's children rose to the rank of Wald, the mother of the child, and in royal households, these women often held considerable influence. The Wald hence could not be sold as property like other concubines could be. Almost all of the Abbasid caliphs were born to slave mothers. Most Umayyad rulers of Spain and of the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, as well as many Twelver imams, were also children of slave mothers. The later Ottoman Empire would also continue this tradition. Going through the literature, one finds that concubine queen mothers had a significant place in Islamic court history throughout the early and medieval Muslim dynasties. In the Abbasid court, slave women by the name of Khazura, Qabiha, and Shaghab emerged as power brokers of the first order. Khazura, an Amazigh or Yemeni woman, was the powerful slave concubine of the Caliph al-Mahdi. She was the mother of the legendary Caliph Harun al-Rashid and his brother al-Hadi. She became essentially the woman behind the throne in the final years of al-Mahdi, the one-year reign of al-Hadi, and then the early years of Harun al-Rashid. It's actually possible that she arranged the murder of al-Hadi in order to secure power for herself under Harun al-Rashid. A considerable market existed for female slaves used for pleasure. Sexually attractive and skilled young women were in demand. Slave manuals tell us that these women were imported from various regions of the Islamic world and beyond, and were often trained in cities like Mecca and Baghdad. The aforementioned Ibn Batlan mentions the slave girls from Mecca as being of the highest skill in singing. Royal harems contained numerous concubines, and it set the standard for elite urban households. An unsettling practice regarding concubines was that of examining them by pressing on their breasts and buttocks while buying them. Sometimes even the genitalia were examined as well, though many slave contracts suggest that genital examination was not the norm. In sexual relations, the consent of the female slave was regarded irrelevant, though they could complain in the court in case of physical harm, but the concubine's lot mostly depended on the owner's nature. However, we should also remember that free wives also had very little choice in the matter of sex and abuse. The core point here is the fact that a slave, male or female, was an uprooted person without any social network to defend them, unlike the case within groups like free wives, for example. This great handicap, besides total financial dependence, made slaves extremely vulnerable. Another point, one that is linked to the Zanj rebellion, is that though blackness had an association with slavery, it was not as direct as it was in the United States or the Caribbean. Other races like Turks, Greeks, Indians, Slavs, and the Amazigh were also slaves, though some scholars believed in the, quote, curse of Ham story justifying racial slavery. Others saw it as an unreliable tale from the Judeo-Christian sources. Scholars like Al-Jahiz and Ibn al-Marzuban contested the linking of slavery and inferiority with blackness. Of course, slaves, including African slaves, posed resistance against their bad treatment. As early as 689, there was a slave revolt against the Umayyads. Another revolt followed in 694 CE. Both were crushed by the strong Umayyad Caliphate. During Abbasid rule, African slaves in Medina rebelled against the governor and his troops in the city. This incident followed the Shia revolt of Muhammad Nafs al-Zakiya of Medina. Another slave revolt occurred between 820 and 834 when slaves from Sindh in modern-day Pakistan rebelled. However, the peak of it all came in 869 when the Zanj rebellion of Basra broke out. In the late 800s, marshlands in southern Iraq had to be reclaimed. This needed back-breaking work in removing the salts and the nitrous topsoil. Slaves, including East African Zanj, were used for this. The historian Gordon says that these rebels were initially employed in sugarcane production. The revolt of the Zanj from 868 to 883 CE was situated in the condition of instability since the death of Caliph al-Mutawakkil, which, like I mentioned before, is known as the anarchy at Samarra. Many caliphs came to the throne in quick succession, with consistent tension between the caliphs and the Turkic slave soldiers, known as the Mamluk. The soldiers were unhappy because they were not paid regularly because of a financial crisis which came due to corruption and problems with the Iqta system of tax collection. In 869, the Caliph Al-Mu'taz abdicated and Al-Muhtadi became the new caliph. With this, there was a revolt among the soldiers coupled with general unrest. Al-Tabari, a contemporary and the most important author for reconstructing the Zanj revolt, talks of this internal strife and chaos as a pretext to the Zanj success. The Abbasids had to deal with other groups as well. A Kharijite uprising led by a person called Musawwir was happening at the same time. Besides, the Caliphate had to deal with the Safarids, who were trying to take over parts of Iran and Central Asia, as well as various Shia insurgents. The Karmatians, another breakaway Shia group, was also emerging around this point. They built their own state in Eastern Arabia with radical ideas like redistribution of wealth and communal ownership. I have a video about that if you want to watch it. So the Zanj revolt developed amidst this overall context of factionalism, chaos, and uncertainty. There are two major sources for the revolt: the Tarikh al-Rasul wal-Muluk of Al-Tabari and the Muruj al-Dhahab of Al-Masudi. Besides these two, Ibn al-Athir's Chronicle, a later work, is also used. Literary works of Arabic poetry and scattered references in other later texts are used for clues as well. The leader of the Zanj uprising, Ali ibn Muhammad, was born near Ray in northern Persia and claimed descent from Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's son-in-law and cousin. However, this is disputed, and many consider him to be either a Persian or from the Abd al-Qais tribe of Eastern Arabia. He started his career as a panegyric poet at Abbasid Caliph al-Muntasir's court. He styled himself as a prophet, inspired by God. He said, "I received signs of my leadership as Imam, which were manifest to the people." Also, he claimed that he received surahs from the Quran, which he said, "I had not learned by heart, and I was not able to recite them in a flash." These claims to a noble lineage, as well as being inspired by God, contributed to him being taken as Imam by many Muslims. Many people in Al-Bahrain saw him as a prophet and even collected taxes in his name. However, the Bahrain uprising was ultimately suppressed. In 868, Ali and a group of followers moved to the Basran marshlands. Al-Tabari says that he forcibly recruited slave workers there, though it's difficult to say how much force was used. In any case, he tried to muster support against the regime among the dissatisfied workers. While trying to build his power base in Basra, he was driven out by the governor and he fled to Baghdad. In September 869, Ali returned to Basra with a bunch of supporters and got close to the Zanj, preparing an uprising. The revolt was finally declared on 7th of September 869. The revolt is divided into two phases. From 869 to 879 was a time of success and expansion, while between 879 and 883 there was decline and ultimately failure. At the break of the revolt, the rebels set out to conquer villages in the vicinity of Basra in southern Iraq. Many slaves and Africans in Abbasid army defected and joined the Zanj. Fun fact here, even a Jew joined the Zanj army, claiming to have found a passage about Ali in the Torah. By October 869, the city of Basra was under siege, but it didn't fall yet. From January to August of 871, Al-Muwaffaq, the brother of Caliph Al-Mu'tamid, fought against the Zanj, but the Abbasids were routed. Finally, in September 871, Basra was captured by the Zanj. All of the city's residents were assembled and a massacre followed. This was coupled with a great pillage. Because of the carnage at Basra, an army was geared up at Samarra, and hence Al-Muwaffaq started out at the head of a large army in March 872. Battles happened for many months, both sides winning some from time to time. In May, a Zanj general, Yahya al-Bahraini, was defeated and captured. He was brought to Samarra on May the 21st, 872, and was publicly executed the next day. After, he was given 200 lashes and his limbs were cut off. However, because of disease spreading, Al-Muwaffaq suspended the fighting and left. By July, his army was scattered, and he reached Samarra in January 873. The failure of this 872 campaign was a big loss for the Abbasids and a huge win for the Zanj. Also, by late 870, the Zanj had entered Khuzestan, reaching the capital Ahvaz. For the next 6 years, Al-Muwaffaq didn't bother with the Zanj, as the Safarids to the east had emerged as a bigger threat. On the 3rd of August, 873, Yaqub al-Safar took over the city of Naysabur. There was also fighting between the Safarids and the Zanj governor of Khuzestan, Ali al-Mahlabi, over the control of Ahvaz. The Safarid threat to the Caliphate lasted for almost 6 years until al-Safar died in June 879. Meanwhile, Abbasid general Musa ibn Mugha carried on the fight against Ali. In 874, the master of Kufa, Ali al-Alawi, was killed by the rebels. In 878, a Zanj general captured the city of Asid, plundered and killed the residents, and burned down the city. A Zanj contingent under a man named Abu al-Mughira al-Makhzumi also attacked the holy city of Mecca. In 879 CE, some Bedouin allies of the Zanj were able to intercept a caravan that was carrying the kiswa, which is the fabric that is used to cover the holy shrine at Mecca and is changed usually every year. By late 879, with the Safarid threat being over, Al-Muwaffaq geared up his army for another round of battle. His son, Abu Abbas, the future Caliph Al-Mu'tadid, was made the commander, and his army was set off in December. Firstly, the Zanj settlement of Al-Siniya was taken in 880. In September, Al-Muwaffaq personally arrived and assumed leadership. The united Abbasid forces razed the Zanj cities of Al-Maniya and Al-Mansura and freed thousands of women and children held as slaves there. They were then sent to Wasit to be reunited with their families. Then the Abbasid army attacked Khuzestan and occupied the province in only 6 weeks. By February 881, all Abbasid troops came together on Al-Mubarak Canal, ready for the final blow, the siege of Al-Muqtara, the Zanj capital, and their final refuge. Al-Muwaffaq tried to cut off the rebels' food and ammunition. The Banu Tamim, who were Bedouin allies of the Zanj and were providing them supplies, were attacked and many were killed. Al-Muwaffaq also tried to win over pro-Zanj groups by promising them amnesty. Groups of rebels, one after the other, deserted Ali during the final siege. Al-Muwaffaq even built a new city there called Al-Muwaffaqiyya. The city of Al-Muqtara was taken section by section. Its buildings and markets were burned, one after the other. The whole siege lasted for more than 2 years. On the 3rd of March 883, Ali's palace was burnt as well while he fled. The final battle started on the 6th of August 883, when Ali's new residence was sieged and he, along with his sons and the remaining forces, were forced to flee to the Al-Sufyani Canal. The final assault was launched on the 11th of August when Ali was killed and his severed head was presented to Al-Muwaffaq, who then prostrated to Allah in thanksgiving. Al-Muwaffaq ordered Ali's head to be put on a lance and paraded. Within the next 3 days, more than 5,000 rebels surrendered. Some fled to the desert, dying of thirst. The Abbasid general then invited those who fled the Zanj aggression to return home. On 27th of November 883, Abu Abbas triumphantly entered Baghdad with Ali's head. The city was in celebration. Many poets have celebrated this event in their verses. Out of Ali's 4 sons, One was killed in 885, while the others died in prison. So yeah, the rebellion was crushed. At least 500,000 are believed to have died. But was all of that fruitless? Did the pain of slavery continue after all? Well, not fully. The historian Alexander Popovich and others point out that the large slave worksites of Lower Iraq disappeared after the revolt, and that was definitely a win for the Zanj. Also, the surrendering rebels were included in the Abbasid army rather than being forced to return to their servile state. It also had political consequences. It helped the Safarid revolt in the east, while helping the Tulunids establish their hold on Egypt and the Levant in the west. It also helped the Karmatians, some of whom apparently made their start in this revolt. Overall, however, the revolt couldn't bring any long-term changes in the practices of slavery in the Islamic world. Now, some points can be looked at. Regarding Ali's ideological influence, the scholar David Waynes points out that the sources indicate both Shia and Kharijite influence. The Zanj banner included the phrase, "God has purchased the souls of the believers and their property, for they are attained for paradise, fighting in the way of God." This has been linked by Waynes to the Kharijite rhetoric. Apart from that, Shia symbolism was used by Ali as well. Because of his leanings towards these non-mainstream strands of Islam, both Kharijite and Shia, many of the contemporary sources about him and his people are quite polemical. So these Sunni sources, some of which I'll be sharing later, cannot exactly be considered 100% truthful, as we don't really have a version written or left behind by Ali's state. So we have to rely on these biased sources. So take it all with a grain of salt is all I'm saying. Besides this religious call, Al-Tabari, as well as modern historians, believed that economic promises made by Ali were the most important reason for the rebels' support. Al-Tabari reports, Ali prayed with them, the Zanj, and in a sermon he recalled the wretched state from which, through him, God had rescued them. Ali said that he wanted to improve their condition, giving them slaves, money, and homes to possess for themselves, and that by them they could achieve the greatest things. Thus, the desire for economic emancipation was a great driver for the rebels. Many of them were slaves who were used en masse in reclaiming the marshlands of southern Iraq, the region around Basra. Their condition was much worse than slaves used for domestic purposes, and of course the Turkic slaves who were used in military services. Hence, the distinction between agricultural slaves in a plantation context and domestic slaves in a familial context is quite important here. Moving beyond the political narrative, one thinks of how the Zanj slave revolt worked. Descriptions of battles and raids are everywhere in Arab chronicles, but what was it actually like living in the Zanj state? What kind of socio-political order did it establish in its 15 or so years of existence? On this, we sadly have much less information. Information on the working of the Zanj state has to be prized out from whatever little is available. Needless to say, there is a considerable lack of detailed information on many of its daily aspects. Regarding the government, we know that Ali ibn Muhammad took the title of Mahdi, or the Guided One, who is prophesied to arrive before the end of times. The label has served as a powerful rallying cry, and many in Islamic history, including the first Abbasid Caliph As-Safa himself, have been called or called themselves Mahdi. As such, Ali ibn Muhammad was regarded as the absolute ruler. He established a capital at a city called Al-Mukhtara and issued orders from there to his generals. Al-Tabari, on several occasions, mentions the existence of divans or offices in Al-Mukhtara. There would probably have been offices for the army, judiciary, and the treasury, but that can't be said for sure. The idea we have of the social hierarchy in the state is very basic, but we know that at the top was Ali and his family, then his close companions. Next were the revolutionary masses, including the Zanj, and then came the subject population living under the Zanj rule. Last in the pyramid were the slaves that the Zanj rebels and leaders had taken. Also, the Zanj regime simply cannot be assumed to be some kind of an egalitarian state. In a text by the later historian Al-Safdi, a nuance in the supposed egalitarian working of the Zanj state is found. Al-Khabith obtained property and riches, seized them to the detriment of others, and gave them to his wives and children. When a group of them, his companions, disapproved, he replied, "My wives are not to be compared to your wives. They have been put to the test living in company with me and are forbidden to other men after me. In that I am equal to the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him salvation, and to the Imams of the right path after him." Here Ali is called Al-Khabith, which basically means the wicked one. So you can imagine that the author of the source was no lover of the Zanj revolt. There's that bias that I mentioned earlier. Al-Safdi further says, when his followers became numerous, he moved the Zanj away from the palm trees and lands under cultivation and forced them to pay a tax, which he distributed to his kin. Then the Zanj became cold-hearted towards him. Their situation worsened and they considered revolting. Besides this, Popovich highlights a very important and potentially revealing fact. There were no Zanj among Ali's high officials. So it appears that a condition of hierarchy and inequality existed even within the ruling rebels. Ali and his family were privileged above the rank and file of the rebels, and black ex-slaves were apparently still not able to rise to the highest echelons. As for the treatment of the populace by the rebels, Al-Masudi narrates, the insolence of the Zanj army was such that they auctioned off the women of the Hassan, the Hussein, and the Abbas families, descendants of Hashim, of Quraysh, and of the most noble Arab families. A young girl would be sold for 2 to 3 dirhams. The crier would announce her genealogy in these terms: such and such, daughter of so and so from such and such family. Each black owned 10, 20, and even 30 of these women, who served them as concubines and performed humble tasks for their wives. One of these captives, who through Hassan descended from Ali, son of Abu Talib, and belonged to a black, begged Ali ibn Muhammad, leader of the Zanj, to give her another master and free her from the one who owned her. "No," replied the leader, "he is your master and suits you better than any other." Large masses of the people of Basra, as well as other captured places, were taken into slavery. Instances of Arab women from noble families being enslaved was a particularly serious crime in the eyes of Arab chroniclers. The rebels built 3 main cities: Al-Maniya, Al-Mansura, and Al-Mukhtara. The capital was at Al-Mukhtara, a place which was chosen because it was quite inaccessible. Another important fact known about the Zanj state is that it issued coins. Archaeological finds confirm that mints existed and were issuing coins as early as 871-872 CE. There were 2 main sources of income for the Zanj state: taxes and spoils of war. Indeed, plunder was a crucial source of money. With regards to this, the French Orientalist Maurice Godfrey de Montaigne writes, Arab historians give us a few characteristics of the strange crowd that made up this Negro army. The great majority did not understand a word of Arabic, and during the great harangues, the chief had the rare individuals capable of understanding his words placed around them. The others would faithfully shout their approval. Its first actions were those of a Negro that abandoned the farms and spread out through the country to pillage. Soon the inhabitants fled them, leaving their possessions behind. This is how the Zanj army collected a few weapons, horses, clothing, and ordinary utensils. At the beginning of their engagement with the Caliph's troops, the Zanj had a few weapons for their front lines. The rest were clubs, bludgeons, and pieces of wood, which they used to kill and wound. Nevertheless, in 870, they captured Al-Abula, Abadan, and Khuzestan, including Ahvaz. In 871, they pillaged Basra. They became a little more organized, but it was still a gang of drunken slaves, good only for pillaging, killing and raping. This passage conveys some of the horrors the raiding ex-slaves inflicted on the people of the settlements in southern Iraq. However, you can not only see some of the biases of the original sources, but also some of the Orientalist tropes of the 19th century peeking through as well. Al-Tabari talks of the army having three parts: infantry, cavalry, and navy, though others have pointed out that the navy was probably just a small appendage to the land troops. One of the biggest debates of this revolt is over the rebels' origins. Even though it is called the Zanj revolt and the leader is called Sahib al-Zanj, or the master of the Zanj, East African black slaves were only a part of the rebellious group. The conventional view, supported by historians like Mark Horton, holds that East African slaves in huge numbers were brought to work as they were immune to malaria in the marshlands. Alan Fisher says that 75% of the workforce in southern Iraq was Zanj. Also, slave trading centers were established by Basran merchants at a place called Kanbulu, Tanzania, and probably Zanzibar. Some also argue that most African slaves in Islamic world were Ethiopian or Nubian or Sudanese. Writers like Al-Masudi, Ibn al-Haql, and later Ibn Battuta also don't give any information on slave trade from the Zanj coast. It appears that Al-Tabari used Zanj as a generic term for Africans of all regions. According to Michael Gordon, textual and genetic evidence suggests that most black rebels were from West and West Central Africa, and the Swahili coast only became an important slave export center from the mid-1700s, almost 1,000 years after the revolts. Also, there were many non-blacks and non-slaves who were parts of the military as well. Theodore Noldeka, writing in 1892, says that poor peasants, Bedouins, as well as black deserters from the Abbasid army joined the rebels. Bernard Lewis also thought that peasants were involved in the struggle against big landowners. Lewis believed that the prospect of substantial plunder brought the support of neighboring tribes. The Banu Tamim and Banu Asad Bedouins, for example, were involved in the capture of Basra. Some historians say that merchants also supported the rebellion, hence calling it a slave rebellion seems somewhat misplaced. As for the external links of the Zanj rebellion, Al-Tabari's account makes it clear that Bedouins were important in providing supplies to the capital of Al-Mukhtara. According to the historian Alexander Popovich, the Zanj did not have any alliance with the Karmatians or the Saffarids. This is supported by the interesting incident of the Safarid, Yaqub al-Safar's rejection of an alliance proposal sent by Ali. In April 876, Yaqub marched to Baghdad but was forced to withdraw. While retreating, Yaqub received an offer from Ali for an alliance. Yaqub al-Safar categorically refused, replying with the following Quranic verses. Say, O infidels, I do not worship what you worship, nor are you worshippers of what I worship. Nor will I be a worshipper of what you worship, nor will you be worshippers of what I worship. To you is your religion, and to me is mine. Another amazing incident was Hamdan Karmat's meeting with the master of the Zanj. Hamdan Karmat was the leader of the Karmatians. Somewhere around 879 CE, Karmat put forward his proposal. Let us compare our beliefs. If we agree, my men and I will join you. If not, we will go away. Give me your word of honor that you will not detain me. However, after a long discussion, Karmat realized that he and Ali could not agree and hence chose to leave the city without any alliance. Nevertheless, it appears that Shia Zanj links existed. Shia supporters of the revolt include Muhammad ibn Sahal Shelma. Shelma wrote the Kitab Akhbar Sahib al-Zanj, an important work on the rebellion which was used by Al-Tabari and Al-Masudi. Many scholars have found the Zanj insurrection to be a remarkable incident, not only in Islamic history but also world history. Some even compared the revolt to that of Spartacus against Rome. James De Vere said that it was perhaps the most successful slave rebellion of all times. The French scholar Charles Pellat called it a proletarian movement. Many have seen it in a negative light, however, with Bernard Lewis terming it a semi-barbarian movement and Karl Brokelman calling it a state run by bandits. Finally, it's very important to understand that the rebellion didn't target the very institution of slavery. Like the revolt of Spartacus, the point for the rebels was coming out of their own misery and not to abolish slavery. This is certainly clear from the fact that the Zanj took a huge number of slaves, and their state was run by slaves just like any other empire. Also, as shown earlier, forms of hierarchy and discrimination existed in their own state. The historian Alexander Popovich thinks that the revolt is important as it resisted the unique attempt to transform domestic slavery into a sort of colonial slavery, if you can use that term, although, for that time, the term might not be appropriate. However, it did not represent any kind of a social revolution. I have always found the Zanj revolt to be fascinating because of the setting and the time period that it took place in. Less than a century after the great House of Wisdom was founded in Iraq, there was a revolt of slaves working less than 600 kilometers to the south. We talk about and appreciate the golden age of Islam, but we don't usually stop to consider what made it possible. You can't spell golden age without gold, of course, and that gold came from economic activities, much of which was fueled by the blood, sweat, and tears of slaves. Slaves stolen from their homes and moved to a new land to do back-breaking work. While it's true that that was the norm of the time, we must also remember the sacrifices they made against their own will to make the Golden Age possible. Sadly, the names of these individuals have been erased, and we cannot really know their individual stories, but we can and should still talk about their stories as groups of people, because the truth is that there is a huge asterisk on the Golden Age of Islam, as there is on any other era of great prosperity of any group of people. See you next time. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon. On the screen right now, you can see the names and tiers of the patrons. You can join them by pledging $1 or more to support the channel. Thank you for watching.